It begins, as so many unsettling stories do, with something ordinary. A box of documents, stacked carelessly in the attic of an abandoned railway office, where dust fell in slow sheets through beams of pale light. The wooden beams creaked in the silence, and rodents scurried in the walls, but it was not the silence, nor the decay, that drew attention. It was the map. A single, folded chart lay pressed between brittle ledgers of freight schedules and weather reports. Its edges were yellowed with age, its surface mottled by water damage, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. Rail lines cut across the paper in precise strokes, their geometry unmistakably the work of a professional surveyor. Along those lines, the names of towns were inscribed. Some were familiar, counties and villages still standing today. Others had long since been abandoned, remembered only in fragments of oral history. But one name, in particular, stood out. A town that no one had heard of. A settlement that, according to every known census, tax record, and map, should not have been there at all. Yet on this fragile document, it was drawn boldly, as if it had been no less real than the others. At first, the discovery seemed curious rather than ominous. Archivists who handled the map described it with the detached fascination one might reserve for a printing error, or a misfiled document. Yet the more they looked, the less sense it made. The handwriting, the ink, the symbols, all were consistent with the rest of the chart. This was not a forgery or careless addition. Whoever had drawn the map had placed the phantom town there with the same conviction as every other settlement. The air around the attic grew heavier in recollection, as if even to remember the discovery was to summon the unease it carried. For those who studied such things, maps were not just tools of navigation. They were records of existence. To mark a place upon a chart was to affirm its reality, to grant it permanence against the erosion of time. And so, the presence of a name that did not belong was not simply a mistake, it was a disruption. Some say the man who first unfolded the map felt something shift in that moment. A sensation subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself tilted, or as if the paper had exhaled after being pressed flat for so long. He ran his finger across the lines and found himself tracing the faded roadways toward that curious name, whispering it aloud in the empty attic. It was a word that rolled strangely off the tongue, familiar in structure, yet foreign in resonance. Like a dream one struggles to recall upon waking, it lingered at the edge of memory. The map was catalogued, photographed, and set aside. Officially, it was nothing more than an artifact of uncertain value, one of thousands salvaged from the archives of a bygone railway system. But privately, it began to trouble the minds of those who had seen it. They spoke of it in quiet tones, as though raising the subject too directly might give it power. Some wondered if the settlement had been erased by time, abandoned before it could ever be counted. Others whispered darker possibilities, that the town had been struck from the record not by accident, but by design. History is full of forgotten places, villages swallowed by floods or famine, names that never reached the permanence of ink. But this was different. This was not a town omitted, but one deliberately placed. And that difference gnawed at the imagination. Why mark what did not exist? Why include it at all, if not to affirm some truth that official records had chosen to bury? The mystery deepened when attempts were made to cross-reference the location. Surveyors, historians, even amateur enthusiasts tried to match the coordinates with modern maps. The result was always the same. The lines pointed to a patch of countryside, real land, real geography, yet no trace of settlement could be found. No foundations, no ruins, no remnants of human habitation. Only woods and waterways, as though the earth itself had swallowed whatever once stood there. What unsettled investigators most was not merely the absence of evidence, but the absence of memory. In surrounding towns, older residents were asked whether they recalled such a place. No one did. Oral histories, usually so generous with half-forgotten names, were silent. Families who had lived in the region for generations looked at the name as though it were a stranger. It was as if the town had never existed in the collective mind, yet had somehow been preserved on paper. The contradiction could not be reconciled. Maps, after all, are meant to guide, to affirm what is real. They do not invent entire communities out of nothing. And yet here was proof of something drawn, something named, something that should have had streets and homes and voices, and yet had none. It is here, at the threshold of absence and presence, that the story finds its heartbeat. A town that exists only on a piece of paper is not just a curiosity, it is a fracture. A question that unsettles the foundations of how we record our world. If something can appear on a map without existing, then what else might linger at the edges of our knowledge? The attic has since been cleared. The railway office no longer stands. But the memory of that map endures, passed down not in official reports, but in whispers, stories of the day a forgotten coordinate surfaced, a name without a home, a town without a history. And from that fragile beginning, a mystery was born. To understand the unease of the map, one must first walk the land it described. The coordinates pointed not to a distant frontier or forgotten desert, but to a stretch of countryside that still exists, verdant, rolling, deceptively ordinary. Hills rise and fall like the folds of a heavy blanket, each slope draped in dense woodland. Streams cut quiet paths through the earth, winding toward rivers that had once carried barges and rafts. On the surface, nothing appears unusual. It is the kind of landscape travelers might pass without a second glance, dismissing it as just another fragment of rural America. Yet it is precisely this ordinariness that makes the absence so pronounced. For centuries, land such as this was never left untouched. Settlers followed rivers, built cabins along fertile soil, and carved roads into even the most unwelcoming terrain. Where water flowed, towns emerged. Where timber grew, sawmills rose. And yet here, where the map insisted a settlement had once stood, there was only silence. Local geographers have described the region in careful detail. The soil is clay-heavy, difficult for farming, though not impossible. The waterways run shallow but steady, enough to sustain livestock. Wildlife flourishes, from white-tailed deer to foxes and hawks. In other words, there was nothing inherently hostile about the environment. Nothing that would explain why a marked settlement never endured. Some have suggested that the very shape of the land played a role. The hills create a labyrinth of valleys, where sound carries in strange ways. Travelers often remark that their own footsteps echo unnaturally, or that distant noises arrive with sudden clarity. Hunters have told of hearing bells or voices, only to find themselves alone. To live in such a place might have been disorienting, unsettling over time. It is easy to imagine how early settlers, sensitive to every rustle in the underbrush, could begin to feel they were being observed. Historical records confirm that neighboring towns thrived. Just 10 miles east, farms grew steadily into a modest trade hub. 5 miles west, a congregation built a church whose bell tower still stands in weathered stone. North and south, hamlets appear in census data, their populations waxing and waning but always accounted for. In this single pocket, however, there is only omission. The cartographer's lines indicate streets where none remain, roads that lead nowhere, names spoken nowhere else. Folklore lingers in such gaps. Oral traditions in the surrounding counties whisper of the hollow that swallows names. Old hunters spoke of paths that could not be retraced, where markers vanished overnight. Some families refused to let their children wander eastward, claiming the woods there carried a weight that pressed upon the chest. None of these stories name the phantom town directly, yet all circle the same geography. The sense is less of a place erased, and more of a place avoided, deliberately, and for reasons no one clearly explained. Cartographic history offers curious parallels. In Europe, phantom islands appeared on maps for centuries, sometimes through error, sometimes through hearsay. Sailors would swear to have seen land where no land existed, and their testimony would be immortalized in ink. Centuries later, these islands would quietly vanish from charts, revealed as illusions. Yet the difference here is stark, islands could be mistaken at sea. But towns are not mirages. They are not vague silhouettes glimpsed across waves. They require names, people, dwellings. They cannot simply be imagined into being. The absence became all the more haunting when early 20th century surveyors retraced the lines. They reported that trails through the valleys seemed to shift. One man wrote of following a stream for hours, convinced he had returned to the same bend multiple times, though his compass insisted he was moving forward. Another noted that markers carved into tree bark were gone when he doubled back, as if the forest had healed itself. These accounts were dismissed by authorities as exaggeration, the product of fatigue and superstition. But taken together, they suggest the land itself resists permanence. What is striking is that no archaeological effort has ever revealed even the faintest trace of settlement. Not a stone foundation, not a rusted nail, not a shard of pottery. This absence is rare. Even the most fleeting homesteads leave behind echoes, fire pits, debris, or disturbed soil. Here, there is only untouched earth. For many, this is the most chilling evidence of all. To build nothing is one thing. But to build and then erase without residue, that suggests something deliberate, something absolute. Modern visitors describe the landscape in paradoxical terms. It is beautiful, yet oppressive. The woods are lush, yet feel barren. One writer likened it to walking through a painting, where everything seems vivid but flat, as though life has been pressed into a still image. Another noted the strange quiet, birdsong present one moment, absent the next, as though silenced by an unseen hand. These impressions are difficult to quantify, yet they echo the unease present in every historical account. For those who seek to rationalize, geology provides an answer. The soil shifts with rain, swallowing shallow impressions. Vegetation regrows quickly, concealing traces of habitation. Streams alter their courses, erasing paths once familiar. Perhaps the land has not conspired to erase memory, but simply followed its own indifferent laws of nature. And yet, this explanation leaves a lingering question: why then was the town marked so confidently on the map? Why would a cartographer, meticulous in his details, assign permanence to a place the earth itself seemed determined to conceal? It is this question that sustains the mystery. The town does not survive in ruins or relics, yet it endures in the unsettling awareness that the land holds a secret. Walk the valleys long enough, and you might feel it, the weight of a name unspoken, the suggestion of footsteps just beyond your vision. The hills carry an emptiness that is not natural, but purposeful. It is a silence that suggests suppression, not absence. This is the landscape that swallowed names, not in a flood, not in fire, but in silence. And it is upon this silence that the map insists otherwise. Between soil and ink, geography and memory, lies a contradiction that demands explanation. One that would lead generations of searchers deeper into mystery, each step bringing them closer to a place they could never quite reach. The phantom town would have remained only a curiosity, a smudge of ink on a fading map, were it not for the man who drew it. Every line of a chart carries with it the signature of its maker, and to understand a town that should not exist, one must first step into the life of the cartographer who gave it a name. His name, preserved in the railway archives, was Thomas Keene. Born in 1824 to a family of modest merchants, he displayed early talent for mathematics and drafting. Apprenticed to a surveyor at the age of 16, Keene was praised for his meticulous eye. He rose quickly through the ranks, eventually securing contracts with railway companies expanding into the American South and Midwest. For nearly 2 decades, his work was impeccable. His maps were praised for their accuracy, his notes for their precision. Townships relied on his measurements, and railroad engineers trusted his surveys to lay their tracks. Colleagues described him as quiet, reserved, yet consumed by his craft. His journals reveal a man devoted to order. He wrote often of angles and distances, of the satisfaction he felt when land surrendered to lines on paper. To him, cartography was not only science, but an act of preservation, an assurance that no path, no settlement, would be forgotten once it was drawn. And yet, woven between the neat figures and tidy sketches, there are anomalies. In the margins of his notebooks appear scattered phrases, written hastily and with less care than the rest. Coordinates withheld. Voices at dusk. A church without a door. These fragments offer no context, and they do not align with any official report. They appear almost as confessions, moments when his hand betrayed thoughts he could not say aloud. What troubles historians most is that Keene had no reputation for carelessness. He was not a man prone to embellishment. If anything, his surviving work suggests rigidity, a near obsession with accuracy. To mark a place that never existed seems wholly unlike him. Which raises the unsettling possibility that, in his mind, the place was real. The only surviving letter that mentions the town was written to a fellow surveyor in 1859. In it, Keene speaks of a valley unlisted in county ledgers, and describes his intent to return there. He writes of peculiar clearings, of structures glimpsed but not approached, and of a sensation, as though the land remembers being walked before. The letter ends abruptly, with a postscript, "I will inscribe it, so that it is not lost." It is this final line that chills modern readers. For in cartography, to inscribe is to legitimize. Keene knew that once a name was placed on a map, it carried a weight beyond mere rumor. Maps endure, memories fade. By writing the name, he preserved something that should otherwise have vanished. There are those who argue that Keene fabricated the town, whether out of vanity, rebellion, or madness. Perhaps he resented the constraints of railway contracts and sought to insert a creation of his own. A cartographer's hoax, a quiet rebellion against an industry that treated land only as profit. Yet this theory collapses under scrutiny. If Keene wished to invent, why not do so boldly? Why choose a place so mundane, so easily lost within surrounding names? Why risk his career by inserting a ghost town that brought him no recognition? Others suggest a different motive, that he marked what he saw, even if it was fleeting. Travelers sometimes speak of settlements encountered on the road, small encampments or temporary dwellings, gone by the time census takers arrived. Could Keene have stumbled upon one of these, misjudging its permanence? Yet again, the details resist this explanation. No remnants of habitation have ever been found. And Keene's own notes describe permanence, streets, structures, even a church. Not tents, not shacks, but something lasting. The most unnerving interpretation is that Keene believed the town existed in a manner not entirely physical. His scattered notes, voices at dusk, coordinates withheld, hint at experiences beyond measurement. Perhaps he walked into something he could not explain, a place that revealed itself only to him. Such notions border on the supernatural, and scholars resist them. Yet one cannot ignore the language of his journals. Precision breaks down into fragments. Order dissolves into suggestion. It is as though he was recording not the land, but an impression left upon it. What became of Thomas Keene after the map is a matter of speculation. By 1862, his name disappears from railway contracts. No further maps bear his signature. Some claim he died of illness during the war years, others believe he abandoned his profession altogether. A few fringe accounts suggest he returned to the valley, determined to settle the question himself, and was never seen again. Whatever the truth, his legacy is bound forever to the phantom town he inscribed. Maps are more than tools, they are promises. Each line assures the traveler that what lies ahead can be trusted. But in Keene's work lies a fracture, a place where certainty fails. To inscribe a town that exists nowhere else is to blur the boundary between fact and imagination. It is to suggest that maps may guide us not only through geography, but through memory, obsession, and silence. The town exists because Keene willed it onto paper. And whether he drew it from truth, madness, or something in between, his act ensured that it could never fully disappear. For so long as his map endures, the town endures with it, trapped between ink and absence, a place both real and unreal, waiting for those who dare to search. The ink on Thomas Keene's map might have faded with time, but the allure of that phantom town only sharpened as the years passed. Maps are not idle curiosities, they are invitations. And for those who saw Keene's chart in the decades after its discovery, the strange, nameless valley marked upon it became a challenge, an enigma that demanded pursuit. If a cartographer had drawn a town, then surely, somewhere, somehow, it must have existed. The earliest searches came from the very industry that had once employed Keene. Railroad companies, hungry for expansion, were eager to verify any possible settlement along their proposed lines. In the 1870s, crews were dispatched with copies of the map, tasked with tracing its coordinates into the wilderness. They carried measuring chains, compasses, and provisions for weeks at a time. Their reports, preserved in company ledgers, reveal a troubling pattern. The expeditions reached the area with precision, yet failed to locate anything resembling habitation. One surveyor described the journey with restrained unease. He wrote of following the map's suggested roadways, only to find paths that dwindled into nothing. Another crew swore they had entered a clearing where the soil appeared unnaturally flat, as though once pressed by foundations. Yet when they marked the place and returned days later, they could not find it again. Even their notched tree markers seemed to vanish, bark appearing whole as though no knife had ever touched it. These incidents were not dramatic, there were no ghostly apparitions, no spectral figures guiding them astray, but they carried a quiet strangeness, the kind that erodes certainty. Men accustomed to order and precision found themselves circling endlessly, unsure whether they had been misled by their instruments or by the land itself. Each crew returned with the same verdict: no town, no ruins, no trace. And yet none could dismiss entirely the feeling that something was concealed just beyond their grasp. By the 1880s, curiosity had spread beyond railroad offices into the surrounding counties. Local farmers, emboldened by rumor, set out in small groups to seek the phantom settlement. Their accounts, passed down in family stories, were more colorful, though no less inconclusive. One group claimed to have heard the tolling of a distant bell at dusk, though no church stood within miles. Another insisted they had stumbled upon an overgrown stone wall, only to lose it again the moment they retraced their steps. Skeptics dismissed such tales as exaggeration, the product of fear and imagination. Yet the persistence of the stories is difficult to ignore. Perhaps the most detailed attempt came in 1891, when a county historical society organized a formal expedition. Armed with compasses, lanterns, and a determination to either prove or disprove the map, they entered the valleys where Keene had once walked. Over 3 days, they documented streams, catalogued flora, and mapped ridges. On the second night, according to their surviving notes, the group became disoriented. Lanterns flickered despite calm air. Paths that seemed familiar led them into deeper thickets. One man insisted they had passed the same fallen oak 3 times, though his companions swore otherwise. In the end, they emerged exhausted, unable to locate the phantom town or even agree upon the routes they had taken. The failure of these expeditions gave rise to competing explanations. Practical minds blamed poor instruments or inexperience. The wilderness is deceptive, they argued, and memory plays tricks in unfamiliar terrain. Religious leaders offered sterner warnings, condemning the searchers for chasing after what should not be found. There are places unblessed, one pastor declared from his pulpit, and to seek them is to invite ruin. For others still, the repeated failures only deepened the mystery. How could so many follow the same map, with such earnest conviction, and return empty-handed? It is worth noting that none of these early attempts ended in tragedy. No one vanished without explanation, no bodies were discovered under peculiar circumstances. The phantom town did not claim lives, it claimed certainty. Searchers returned safely, but with the unsettling realization that they could not account for their failure. That was, perhaps, more disorienting than any calamity. By the turn of the century, the phantom settlement had taken root in local imagination. It was no longer just a curiosity in the railway archives, it had become a test of courage. Young men dared one another to follow the map's route at night. Families whispered warnings not to wander too far east of the county line. The name of the town, inscribed by Keene, began to circulate in hushed tones, though always with a sense of unease. Speaking it aloud seemed almost to summon the weight of the absence itself. Historians of the era, intrigued by the persistence of the story, attempted their own rationalizations. Some argued that Keene had intended the town as a placeholder, marking land purchased for settlement that never materialized. Others suggested a clerical error, a confusion of names transposed from one county to another. Yet these explanations faltered under scrutiny, for none accounted for the consistency of the reports, the oddities of the land, or the strange conviction with which Keene had written his final words, "I will inscribe it, so that it is not lost." Even into the early 20th century, attempts to locate the town continued. Amateur explorers, folklorists, and wanderers traced the valleys, each reporting the same bewildering experiences, paths that seemed to double back, clearings that shifted, an atmosphere of weight. One explorer summarized it in a single line, "The land knows what we seek, and hides it." Thus the search for the phantom town entered legend, not through discovery, but through perpetual failure. Each attempt ended not with answers, but with deeper questions, as though the land itself was conspiring to preserve a secret. The map remained, fragile and insistent, a promise unfulfilled. And those who followed its lines found themselves not closer to the truth, but entangled in the silence of a place that refused to be found. If the wilderness held only silence, the archives spoke in fragments. Long before the age of digitized records, history was preserved in ledgers, parish books, and yellowing newspapers stacked in county courthouses. It was within these dusty halls that the phantom town began to surface again, not in full form, but in whispers, scattered references that seemed to drift through the cracks of official memory. The first came from shipping records dated to the 1860s. A ledger in the county clerk's office contained routine entries, grain shipments, lumber consignments, barrels of salt pork bound for local markets. Yet nestled between these mundane notations was a single entry that puzzled archivists. It listed goods arriving from the phantom town's name, carefully written in the same hand as the surrounding entries. The clerk made no distinction, no note of uncertainty. To him, it appeared as ordinary as any other town. And yet, no such town appeared in the census for that year, or any year before or after. Then there was the matter of the church rolls. Among the microfilmed records of a Presbyterian congregation in a neighboring village, one baptismal registry contained a startling anomaly. Several children, baptized in the 1850s, were listed with parents of the phantom town's name. The handwriting was crisp, deliberate, leaving little room for misinterpretation. Later records from the same church, however, showed no trace of such families. It was as if they had appeared, participated in ritual, and vanished without leaving descendants in the region. Even more unsettling was a newspaper clipping preserved in a private scrapbook. Dated 1874, the article was a short obituary column, reprinted from a rural gazette that no longer exists. It mentioned the death of a young woman, of the phantom town's name, survived by no family, remembered only for her kindness in teaching local children to read. The notice was brief, unremarkable, yet its reference to a non-existent town turned it into an enigma. Scholars scoured surviving editions of the paper but found no corroborating details, as though the clipping itself had slipped through from another reality. Taken individually, these documents could be dismissed as errors, misprints, or even hoaxes. But collectively, they formed a pattern, scattered acknowledgments of a place no one could find. And it was the very incompleteness of this evidence that made it so haunting. History is built upon fragments, but here the fragments seem to point not to a larger whole, but to a void. Archivists who handled these materials described the experience in curiously personal terms. One wrote that every time he encountered the town's name, it felt less like reading a record and more like overhearing a conversation not meant for me. Another remarked that the references seemed to emerge only in the margins, as though history itself hesitated to speak them aloud. It was not only what was written that unsettled, but how it appeared, always briefly, always indirectly, as though the town hovered at the edge of acknowledgement. Skeptics argue that such anomalies are the inevitable detritus of record-keeping. Clerks made mistakes, typesetters misaligned names, and oral information was often transcribed imperfectly. The phantom town, they insist, is nothing more than an accumulation of such errors. But even skeptics admit that the sheer consistency of the name across decades is difficult to dismiss. Errors scatter randomly, they do not repeat with such precision. More troubling still is the disappearance of certain documents. In the 1930s, a county archivist noted references to land deeds tied to the phantom town. When researchers attempted to locate these records decades later, they were gone. The index still listed them, but the deeds themselves had been removed. No explanation was ever given. Some whispered that officials had deliberately destroyed the papers to silence an inconvenient anomaly. Others believed the documents had been stolen by collectors who prized artifacts tied to the unexplained. Whatever the reason, their absence only deepened the mystery. The archives, then, became less a repository of answers than a theater of unease. Each surviving fragment teased with the possibility of truth, but none offered confirmation. It was history told through absences, a ledger entry with no town to match, a baptismal roll with no descendants, an obituary for a woman whose grave was never found. Each whisper was like a thread dangling from a tapestry, suggesting a hidden design, yet unraveling when pulled. For modern researchers, these discoveries evoke an uncomfortable realization: perhaps the phantom town was never meant to be remembered whole. Perhaps it survives only in these fleeting references because that is all history could bear to record. In the margins of ledgers, in the half-legible obituaries, in the vanished deeds, the town persists, not as presence, but as absence. And it is precisely this pattern that unsettles the most. A town forgotten by all, yet remembered just enough to leave faint echoes in the archives. A name that refuses erasure, yet resists discovery. Not entirely real, not entirely lost. Suspended between existence and oblivion, waiting for anyone who dares to follow its trail of whispers. Religion often stands as both guardian of truth and gatekeeper of silence. In the story of the phantom town, this paradox found its sharpest expression in the words and actions of a country pastor whose refusal to acknowledge its existence shaped how the community remembered, or forgot, the anomaly. The pastor in question, Reverend Elias Turner, presided over a modest congregation in the late 19th century. His church, a white wooden structure perched on a hill overlooking the county's main river, served as both sanctuary and meeting hall for a scattered population. By all accounts, Turner was a man of conviction, his sermons thundered against moral decay, his discipline was uncompromising, and his presence carried a gravity that made men bow their heads instinctively when he passed. Yet beneath this austere exterior lay a man uniquely positioned to confront the whispers of a town that appeared in records but not on maps. The earliest documented confrontation occurred in 1876. A farmer had approached Turner with confusion after finding his deceased brother's estate papers. Among them was a land deed naming property near the phantom town's name. Uncertain what to make of it, the farmer brought the matter before his pastor, expecting guidance. Turner's response was swift and unambiguous: "There is no such place, and to speak of it is to indulge falsehood. Destroy the paper, and let your brother rest." According to the farmer's descendants, the deed was indeed burned, reduced to ash before the parlor fire that very evening. This refusal was not an isolated incident. Other testimonies, pieced together decades later from letters, memoirs, and oral histories, suggest that Turner actively discouraged any discussion of the town. When a young woman questioned why her grandmother's baptismal record listed the family as, of the phantom town's name, Turner reportedly told her it was a clerical error that should not trouble the faithful. When a traveling merchant claimed to have once delivered goods to the town in his youth, Turner dismissed him publicly, accusing the man of drunken invention. The vehemence of Turner's denials intrigued later historians. Was he simply a rationalist, eager to suppress what he saw as superstition? Or did he know more than he allowed? Some point to his theological writings, fragments of which survive in church archives. In one sermon draft, never delivered but scrawled in his unmistakable hand, Turner wrote, "There are places that tempt the soul with illusions of substance. But to grant them recognition is to open the door to ruin. The duty of the shepherd is not to explore the shadow, but to keep his flock from wandering into it." Such words suggest more than mere clerical caution, they imply a belief in dangerous liminality, in the idea that some names or places could ensnare the mind simply through acknowledgement. To Turner, silence was not ignorance, it was protection. Yet not all shared his conviction. A handful of parishioners resented his suppression, feeling that questions were brushed aside rather than answered. One elderly congregant, interviewed in the 1920s, recalled, "We weren't allowed to speak of it. If anyone raised the matter, the reverend would thunder down with scripture about false idols and lying spirits. But it wasn't idolatry we felt, it was confusion." And in his silence, that confusion only grew. The wider county community absorbed Turner's posture of denial. By discouraging discussion within his parish, and by extension influencing neighboring congregations, he helped ensure that official memory of the phantom town remained fragmented and suppressed. Local newspapers, where clergy often had sway over editorial boards, rarely printed references after Turner's ascendancy. Documents that might have fueled speculation were quietly discarded or discredited. Through sheer force of conviction, one man seemingly pressed an entire community into silence. But was silence ever truly complete? Among the most chilling accounts is a story preserved in a family diary. In 1882, a parishioner recorded that after evening service, several children whispered about hearing their parents mention the phantom town by candlelight. The pastor, overhearing, grew stern and addressed the congregation, "The enemy prowls in many guises, but none more insidious than the false memory of a place that never was. Guard your tongues, lest you conjure what should not be." The diarist wrote that his words fell over the room like a shroud, and from that day forward, no child dared mention it again. For some, Turner's denials only increased suspicion. Why would a man of God, charged with guiding his flock through truth, so vehemently suppress harmless questions? Was he shielding them from madness, or concealing something darker? One theory suggests that Turner himself may have once visited the phantom town, and that whatever he witnessed left him shaken to the core. His sermons about illusions of substance and ruinous shadows hint at personal experience, not abstract theology. Another theory paints him as a practical man who recognized the social danger of obsession. A community caught chasing a non-existent town might unravel into paranoia. What cannot be denied is the effectiveness of his campaign. For decades after Turner's tenure, the phantom town faded further into obscurity. Later generations recalled his name not for the fervor of his faith but for the strictness of his silence. To speak of the town was to risk rebuke, ridicule, even ostracism. And so, people learned to bury their curiosity, even as faint traces continued to surface in records and rumors. Modern historians examining this period often remark on the irony: in seeking to erase the town, Turner preserved it. His very denials became part of the story, ensuring that future researchers would stumble upon his refusals alongside the fragmented records. Without his thunderous opposition, the whispers might have dissolved entirely into the background noise of clerical errors and fading memory. Instead, his suppression gave them shape, framing the town as something so perilous it could not be named. Thus, Reverend Elias Turner stands as a paradoxical figure in the mystery of the phantom town. He denied its existence with every fiber of his being, yet his denials carved its shadow deeper into the county's history. Was he a guardian, shielding his flock from dangerous illusions? Or was he, unknowingly, the town's greatest witness, testifying to its haunting reality through the very fervor of his refusal? The answer remains elusive. But the legacy of his silence endures, a reminder that sometimes denial is not the end of a story but the beginning of its most enduring mystery. History is not a fixed ledger of truths but a fragile tapestry woven from documents, memory, and interpretation. When threads fray, or when entire patterns vanish, scholars step forward to repair, to clarify, to insist that reason can prevail where mystery lingers. And so it was with the phantom town. Once dismissed by a pastor and suppressed in local memory, it resurfaced through the relentless curiosity of academics determined to reconcile what should have been impossible. The first of these figures was Professor Henry Wilcox, historian at Emory College in the 1890s. Wilcox specialized in cartography and land records, fascinated by how borders shifted and towns rose or fell across the southern states after the Civil War. It was during a survey of county archives that he stumbled upon the name of the phantom town, scrawled not once, but dozens of times, across deeds, marriage licenses, and even tax rolls. The shock was not that the town had been mentioned, but that it was mentioned consistently, over a span of nearly 40 years, before abruptly vanishing from all record. Wilcox grew obsessed. In his notebooks, many of which survive today in a university collection, he scrawled lists of every reference, arranging them by date, source, and type. He drafted maps aligning known settlements with the mysterious town, calculating where it should have been located. Yet when he visited the supposed site, he found only pine forest and a shallow creek. No trace, he wrote in 1894. The coordinates demand settlement, yet the earth denies it. The puzzle attracted the attention of others. By the early 20th century, several graduate students and amateur historians had joined in what came to be known, informally, as the vanishing point problem. Each sought to prove the town had been real, perhaps a temporary settlement erased by fire or flood, or to demonstrate that clerical repetition had created a phantom through error. The debates filled pages of obscure historical journals, sparking both fascination and ridicule. One camp argued the town had been nothing more than a clerical duplication. They noted that record-keepers often copied older documents by hand, and a single mistaken entry could echo across decades. According to this theory, the phantom town was an accounting ghost, born not of reality but of ink and human error. Another camp, however, pointed to the diversity of records, deeds filed by farmers, marriage licenses signed by clergy, even court summons naming individuals, of the phantom town. The consistency, they argued, was too strong to dismiss as accident. As the 20th century advanced, scholars applied new tools. By the 1930s, aerial photography provided sweeping views of the county landscape. Analysts combed over the images for signs of old foundations, abandoned roads, or crop marks betraying forgotten settlements. None were found. In the 1960s, geographers employed soil analysis and ground surveys. Again, no evidence emerged. The supposed location remained stubbornly blank, its silence mocking every attempt at confirmation. The frustration deepened when oral historians uncovered families whose genealogies seemed entangled with the phantom town. Elderly descendants recalled hearing grandparents mention being born or married there. Some carried Bibles with family records inscribed, the town's name carefully written beside dates of birth or death. These testimonies, fragile but persistent, complicated the scholar's quest. Were these memories mere echoes of clerical mistakes? Or did they preserve, across generations, the fading imprint of something that had once stood and then was erased? By the late 20th century, the vanishing point problem had become a niche fascination within historical circles. Conferences hosted panels where scholars debated fiercely. Some leaned on Occam's razor, urging colleagues to accept error as the simplest explanation. Others invoked folklore studies, suggesting that communities sometimes invent a town, a name, or a place to fill cultural or psychological needs, an imaginary anchor that slips into the record by sheer force of repetition. Yet a stubborn minority held firm that the town had been real. Their arguments rested on the sheer weight of documentation. Errors replicate, one wrote, but they do not replicate across 4 decades, in multiple hands, and under varying circumstances. Something existed. What it was, we may never know, but to deny its existence entirely is to deny the very function of record-keeping. The debate reached its most dramatic moment in the 1980s, when a team of archivists uncovered a forgotten box in the basement of the county courthouse. Inside lay ledgers from the 1850s, including tax rolls that listed citizens residing in town. The entries were meticulously detailed, names, properties, levies, all pointing to a community that, at least in the eyes of local government, was as real as any other. Yet cross-referencing those names with later census records revealed a troubling pattern. Many seemed to vanish without trace, their lines ending abruptly, as though the people themselves had dissolved alongside the town. It was this discovery that reignited public fascination. Newspapers picked up the story, framing it as a historical enigma. Headlines spoke of "the town that slipped through time" and "the vanishing point of Georgia." Documentaries followed, bringing cameras to the forest where nothing remained, juxtaposing the silent creek with the stubborn persistence of archival ink. For scholars, the renewed attention was bittersweet. On one hand, the mystery invited funding, conferences, and the thrill of public interest. On the other, it blurred the line between serious history and sensationalism. Some feared that the town, whatever it had been, was slipping from scholarly debate into the realm of myth, a curiosity to be consumed, not understood. And yet, the vanishing point problem endures. Today, university databases hold digitized copies of the documents. Genealogists trace family lines that end at the phantom town. Folklorists collect stories that blend fact and fiction. Scientists scan the land with ground-penetrating radar, still finding nothing. Every discipline approaches the mystery with its own tools, and every discipline walks away unsettled. In the end, the scholars achieved neither resolution nor consensus. The town remained a hole in the record, a blank page that resisted ink. But perhaps their greatest contribution was not proof or disproof, but articulation. They gave the enigma a name, the vanishing point. By doing so, they transformed scattered confusion into a focused problem, one that continues to draw curiosity long after the town itself, or its absence, has been forgotten by the land. The phantom town did not survive. But the scholars ensured that its mystery would. Every mystery, no matter how fiercely debated or how persistently studied, eventually enters a period of exhaustion. For the phantom town, that exhaustion arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, until all that remained was a silence as thick as the pine woods that covered the supposed ground. The scholars had argued, the families had whispered, the clergy had denounced, but over time each voice grew dim. By the mid-20th century, the debate had lost its momentum, and the phantom town slipped into a twilight of near-forgetting. The collapse began not with a dramatic revelation, but with absence. After the excitement of the courthouse discovery in the 1980s, the promise of new evidence dwindled. Archaeological digs unearthed nothing more than pottery fragments too generic to prove origin. Soil analysis, though advanced, told no story of foundations, fires, or cultivated fields. The land seemed untouched, as if no tool or plow had ever broken its surface. The weight of non-findings grew heavier than the archives themselves. Researchers who had once spoken with conviction now hesitated, their papers filled with qualifiers, perhaps, possibly, uncertain. Meanwhile, the community surrounding the site grew tired of the attention. For locals, the mystery had long been a source of unease, tourists arriving to stare at empty woods, journalists knocking on doors, scholars tramping through creeks with notebooks in hand. A generation raised in the shadow of those visits began to resent the intrusion. Some even refused to speak of the phantom town altogether, dismissing it as a distraction from more pressing local struggles, poverty, industry decline, the quiet hardships of rural life. This resistance contributed to the silence. Oral historians, who had once recorded careful interviews with elderly residents, now found doors closed to them. Families who had once offered genealogical Bibles or fading letters withdrew them from public view. "We have nothing to say," one resident wrote in a curt letter to a university researcher in 1992. "Leave it buried." It was not simply a matter of disinterest, it was weariness, the slow collapse of patience under the weight of repetition. At the same time, the academic world shifted focus. History departments turned toward cultural theory, postmodern analysis, and global narratives. A phantom town in rural Georgia seemed provincial, almost quaint, compared to the urgent demands of a rapidly changing field. Funding dried up, and graduate students looked elsewhere for dissertations. The vanishing point problem, once the subject of heated panels, was reduced to footnotes in niche journals. Silence, in this case, was not just local but institutional. And yet, the silence did not feel natural. It carried the weight of avoidance, as though something unresolved lingered beneath the soil. Scholars who had withdrawn from the debate often admitted, in private letters, that they remained haunted by the town. "I cannot stop thinking about it," wrote one in 2001. "Even absence has weight. Even nothingness leaves a shape in the air." Such sentiments rarely reached publication, for to confess obsession with something unprovable was to risk ridicule. By the turn of the century, the phantom town existed in two forms: a dismissed curiosity in the academic world, and a half-forgotten rumor in local memory. Yet in both, it carried a strange persistence. The silence surrounding it was not the silence of resolution but of suspension. No one had proved it false. No one had explained it away. The evidence remained: the maps, the tax rolls, the marriage licenses, the Bibles. They had not vanished. They simply sat unread, gathering dust in climate-controlled archives. For the few who dared return to the site, the atmosphere was unmistakable. The woods seemed ordinary, pines whispering in the wind, a creek trickling through sand and stone. Yet visitors often reported an unease, as if the forest resisted intrusion. The silence there was not merely the silence of nature, but something denser, more deliberate. One journalist described it as a silence that feels rehearsed, as though the land itself has decided to remain mute. The collapse of discourse had unintended consequences. Without scholars to frame the debate, and without locals willing to share memory, the vacuum was filled by fringe voices. Paranormal enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and amateur explorers began to dominate the conversation. Online forums lit up with speculations of time slips, government cover-ups, even supernatural erasure. For every careful article published in the decades before, dozens of lurid stories now emerged, unmoored from fact. The silence of serious voices had allowed noise to reign. Still, beneath that noise, the deeper silence persisted. No new documents emerged. No physical evidence surfaced. The phantom town remained suspended in its paradox, recorded yet absent, inscribed yet invisible. The collapse of inquiry had not solved the mystery, but it had granted it a strange endurance. By refusing to resolve, the town had become a fixture of absence itself, a case study in how history sometimes dissolves into fog without ever reaching shore. Silence, however, is rarely final. It is more often a pause, a space where memory waits. In the case of the phantom town, that silence seemed almost protective. It shielded the enigma from overexposure, from the relentless tug of explanation. And perhaps, in that protection, it ensured that the mystery would survive into another era. For if the town had been conclusively debunked, it would have been forgotten. But because it could not be erased, and yet could not be proven, it remained, half in history, half in shadow. The collapse, then, was not an end but a transformation. The phantom town ceased to be an academic problem or a local nuisance. It became something more spectral, a silence that demanded interpretation, a gap that insisted on attention. And in that silence, listeners began to hear echoes, faint, uncertain, but impossible to dismiss. The woods stood still. The creek flowed as it always had. And the silence deepened, not as emptiness, but as presence. When the silence of the phantom town finally settled into permanence, what followed was not erasure, but transformation. Mysteries seldom vanish entirely, they shift shape, dispersing into fragments of memory, rumor, and story. In the aftermath of its collapse from the public record, the phantom town was reborn in another form, as folklore, whispered by locals, retold in fragments, and carried into the realm of cultural myth. The first seeds of folklore appeared in the mid-20th century, long after the town's final archival mention. Children in rural Georgia spoke of the lost town in the trees, where voices could be heard if one walked the old creek path at dusk. Hunters claimed that the woods sometimes carried echoes of hammers and saws, though no structures stood there. Teenagers dared one another to spend nights near the site, reporting strange sensations, sudden chills, the feeling of being watched, the sound of wagon wheels rolling over earth that no longer bore roads. Folklore thrives where evidence falters. With scholars stepping back and locals withdrawing, the story of the phantom town found new life in these rumors. For many, the absence of proof was not an obstacle, it was an invitation. The less that could be pinned down, the more room there was for imagination to fill the gaps. Some told of entire families swallowed by the earth. Others claimed the town had been struck from maps by divine punishment, wiped away for sins too dark to name. A few insisted that it still existed, not in this time, but in another, visible only in moments of rupture, a lantern-light glimpsed through trees, the sound of a fiddle carried on the wind. The folklore grew alongside cultural shifts in America. By the 1970s, with the rise of paranormal television and urban legends, the phantom town became a regional tale traded in roadside diners and campfires. Writers of small-town newspapers sometimes mentioned it in Halloween editions, crafting sensational accounts of Georgia's town that never was. Churches occasionally used it in sermons, framing the vanishing as a cautionary allegory of pride, temptation, or divine erasure. In every telling, the story bent to the teller's needs. But folklore is not only told, it is lived. Some families in nearby counties began to incorporate the phantom town into their own identities. Descendants of settlers, uncertain whether their ancestors had ties to the mysterious place, sometimes embraced the connection as a badge of uniqueness. "My great-grandmother always said her sister lived in the town that disappeared," one woman told an interviewer in 1995. "She never said its name. Just, the town you can't find no more." In this way, the phantom town blurred the boundary between genealogy and legend. The absence of the town from official maps and records also gave it power in cultural imagination. Across America, ghost towns are usually visible: ruined saloons, collapsed mines, skeletal houses left behind. But here was a ghost town without bones, a phantom with no trace. That inversion fascinated storytellers. Writers of regional fiction borrowed the motif, using the phantom town as inspiration for stories of places swallowed by swamps, cursed crossroads, or forgotten wars. Even when unnamed, its shadow spread. By the early 21st century, digital culture gave the folklore a new platform. Online forums devoted to unsolved mysteries circulated grainy photographs of the forest, claiming to show faint outlines of buildings in the underbrush. Paranormal blogs repeated the tale with embellishments: glowing apparitions, sudden loss of GPS signal, compasses spinning wildly near the creek bed. Amateur documentarians uploaded shaky footage of midnight visits, narrating their unease in whispers. Each retelling strayed further from the careful historical debate of the past, yet each carried a thread of the same eerie heart: a town that once was, but could not be found. Folklore, unlike scholarship, does not demand resolution. It thrives on ambiguity, using it as oxygen. The phantom town, once a matter of archival dispute, now became a parable about absence itself. Teachers used it to warn children not to wander too far into the woods. Elders used it as an explanation for strange noises at night. Storytellers used it as a metaphor for loss, impermanence, and the fragility of memory. In these retellings, the town no longer needed to be proved. Its very elusiveness was its truth. Yet folklore also carries a quiet defiance. Beneath the surface of these tales lay a refusal to let the town be forgotten entirely. The locals who avoided scholarly interviews might still tell their grandchildren, in hushed tones, of the place that the maps forgot. Even those who denied its importance could not quite keep it from slipping into their language, their jokes, their fears. The silence that once marked its collapse had become a fertile ground for stories to bloom. The aftermath of the phantom town was not its disappearance, but its persistence in another dimension. While the archives gathered dust, the town lived on in words, in whispers, in the imagination of those who walked the land. A child hearing the tale for the first time might feel a shiver, looking at the woods with new eyes, wondering what lay beneath the trees. A traveler reading of it in a folklore collection might take a detour, hoping to glimpse something that could not be seen. This is the legacy of unresolved mysteries: they rarely end, but rather transform. The phantom town was no longer just a historical puzzle. It was a cultural ghost, a story passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. And in some ways, that made it more enduring than if it had ever been solved. A solved mystery dies in its explanation. An unsolved one lives forever in the tension between what was and what might have been. Thus, in the end, the phantom town found its survival not in maps or monuments, but in the fragile, persistent realm of folklore. It endured as a story of vanishing, of silence, of something that should not have been forgotten yet could not be remembered. And in every telling, whether whispered in the woods or posted on a screen, it carried the same haunting truth: the absence of proof does not erase presence. It merely changes the way presence is felt. And so the phantom town, unseen but never gone, continues to exist, half in the world, half in the imagination. Its aftermath is not silence at all, but story. When folklore carries a mystery into the future, speculation follows. The phantom town, stripped from records yet anchored in whispers, could not remain untouched by theories. People demanded explanations, even if none could be proved. From scholars to locals, skeptics to dreamers, each interpretation became its own shadow, a projection cast onto the blank wall of uncertainty. The earliest serious attempts to explain the town's disappearance came from regional historians in the early 20th century. One theory suggested bureaucratic error, that the town was never more than a cartographic mistake, created by miscopied survey notes, then perpetuated through repetition before being quietly abandoned. According to this view, the town never truly existed. It was an illusion born of ink and paper. Yet such a claim raised more questions than it answered. If it was only a mistake, why did multiple maps reference it across decades? Why did oral histories speak of families who supposedly lived there, trading goods and raising children? Why did railroad planners once sketch lines passing near it? The idea of a pure error felt too simple. Another theory pointed to economics. Perhaps the town existed briefly as a sawmill settlement or a mining camp, tied to a single resource. When the resource dried up, or when the economy shifted, the settlement collapsed so quickly that little was left. In such cases, records might have been lost, abandoned, or deliberately discarded. Some ghost towns in America followed this pattern. They rose fast, burned brightly, then vanished, leaving little but rumors and rust. But again, there was the problem of traces. Even the shortest-lived mining camps left foundations, graves, or debris. Why did this town leave none? Could erasure be so complete that not a stone nor a nail remained? Skeptics struggled with this absence, unable to reconcile the natural decay of settlements with the total void that followed. As the 20th century moved into the 21st, stranger theories emerged. Some leaned toward the supernatural. Believers in dimensional rifts claimed the town had slipped out of our world, erased by forces beyond comprehension. They cited accounts of sudden fogs, of disorientation in the woods, of time seeming to fold in on itself. To them, the town had not died, it had shifted, hidden in a parallel space accessible only in fleeting moments. Others invoked curses. The town, they suggested, had been struck from memory for acts of unspeakable sin. Perhaps its people turned against one another. Perhaps violence or ritual sealed its fate. Local preachers sometimes hinted at divine punishment, framing the erasure as a lesson against pride. In these retellings, the absence of remains was not evidence against the town's existence, it was proof of judgment, a supernatural cleansing that left nothing behind. Folklore scholars, however, pointed to cultural psychology. They argued that the phantom town represented collective memory itself, shaped and reshaped by need. A community might invent a vanished place to explain gaps in genealogy, to provide mystery in a landscape, or to embody the tension between past and present. According to this view, the town existed not in the soil, but in the imagination, an expression of human longing for meaning in silence. Theories layered upon theories, often contradicting one another, yet all feeding the fascination. In the 1990s, a team of amateur archaeologists scoured the supposed site with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. They found only scattered nails and wagon parts, none definitive, none sufficient to mark a town. The ambiguity of their results only deepened the sense of mystery. Internet forums magnified these debates. Some users shared family stories, swearing their ancestors once lived in the vanished place. Others insisted the tale was a hoax, inflated by storytellers seeking attention. Conspiracy-minded voices suggested government involvement, that the town had been deliberately erased to conceal something, a failed experiment, a hidden atrocity, or an industrial accident buried under official silence. Without evidence, these theories remained speculation, yet their persistence reflected the hunger for resolution. Among academics, one of the most compelling theories was not about the town itself, but about perception. They argued that the phantom town was a case study in how history interacts with belief. Records can disappear, but memory lingers. Communities can forget, but stories endure. The absence of proof does not erase the human need to ask questions. Thus, the phantom town became an open canvas, where each generation painted its own explanation according to its fears and desires. And perhaps that was the truest theory of all, that the phantom town survived not through its material existence, but through the shadows it cast. Every hypothesis, whether rooted in error, economics, or the supernatural, revealed more about the storytellers than about the place. A town that cannot be found becomes a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of those who search for it. In this way, the theories themselves became part of the folklore. When a child heard that the town was cursed, the fear was not of archives but of divine wrath. When a skeptic argued it was a mapmaker's mistake, the lesson was about human fallibility. When a dreamer imagined it slipping into another dimension, the mystery transformed into possibility. Each explanation kept the story alive, weaving new threads into its ever-expanding fabric. Theories, like shadows, stretch and shift depending on the light. And in the case of the phantom town, the light has always been dim, filtered through trees, scattered by silence. No single explanation holds, because the mystery resists capture. What remains is not certainty, but an evolving chorus of possibilities, each one echoing into the woods where the town once might have stood. And so, as the years lengthen, the phantom town remains unsolved, anchored not by evidence, but by imagination. In the end, the mystery is less about what truly happened, and more about why people cannot let it go. The shadows of theory are proof that absence, when powerful enough, can become presence. Every story eventually reaches its final breath, yet the phantom town never truly ended. It lives in silence, in the absence that lingers more heavily than presence. For more than a century, its coordinates have been a blank spot on the map, but in conversation, in memory, and in folklore, it continues to pulse faintly, like the echo of a bell long extinguished, still trembling in the air. When travelers speak of the region, they describe a strange hush in the trees, a muted quality to the wind that carries through the hollows. Hikers claim that birds fall quiet without warning, leaving only the sound of their own breathing. Some say the woods themselves resist trespass, that compasses falter near the rumored site, that modern GPS devices misalign in peculiar ways. Whether these reports are rooted in fact or in suggestion hardly matters. What matters is that they persist, layering silence with unease. The legacy of the phantom town is not marked by ruins, gravestones, or relics. It is marked by the strange power of erasure. In most histories, places die loudly, through fire, flood, famine, or abandonment. Remains are left behind, the skeleton of a church, the frame of a house, the lines of a forgotten street. But here, there is nothing. Nothing visible, nothing tangible. The town's silence has become its defining monument. And silence, it turns out, is often louder than sound. In the absence of physical evidence, the human mind invents stories to fill the void. Parents warn children not to wander too far into the forest. Elders remind communities that the past can disappear without warning. Writers, filmmakers, and storytellers draw upon the mystery, weaving their own interpretations of what may have happened. In each case, the silence becomes a canvas, open to endless reinvention. Yet beyond the folklore and speculation, there remains an emotional resonance. The idea of a town erased stirs something fundamental in the human spirit, the fear of being forgotten. Cities rise with pride, families build legacies, individuals carve names into stone. But what if, despite all effort, a community can vanish entirely, leaving not even a trace? The phantom town embodies this terror. It is less a ghost story than a reminder of impermanence, that permanence itself may be an illusion. Scholars who study the legend often remark that its endurance lies in its ambiguity. Had clear proof been found, records in archives, foundations in soil, the mystery would have hardened into history. But because clarity is absent, imagination reigns. The story continues not as fact, but as possibility. And in this way, the silence is not an end but a beginning, a springboard for generations of speculation. Local families still recall fragments, though often contradictory. Some remember hearing that a relative once lived near the vanished town. Others insist that their ancestors warned against speaking of it at all. A handful of elders quietly admit to visiting the supposed site in childhood, only to find themselves disoriented, unable to locate it again. These testimonies, fragile and scattered, form a patchwork that never coheres into certainty. Each voice adds a thread, yet the fabric remains incomplete. The phantom town's silence has also shaped the identity of the region itself. Tourism pamphlets avoid it, preferring safer legends of battlefields and historic homesteads. Yet within the community, the story persists in quiet exchanges, in tales told over firelight, in uneasy glances toward the woods. For those who live nearby, the silence is not entertainment but inheritance, a reminder that they dwell beside something unexplainable, something erased yet not erased. Writers of Gothic literature often speak of the sublime, the mixture of wonder and dread that arises when confronting vastness or absence. The phantom town has become a modern embodiment of that idea. It is not a ruin to visit, nor a preserved site to tour, but a void to contemplate. In its emptiness, it suggests both loss and infinity, both mortality and mystery. It reminds us that history is fragile, that memory can be swallowed, that human lives can be erased without leaving a footprint. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of its legacy is how silence resists resolution. Every attempt to define the town, whether as error, settlement, curse, or dimension, collapses against the same absence. And so, the silence continues, refusing closure. Listeners lean forward, expecting revelation, only to discover that the story ends not with discovery but with a void. It is in that void, that unanswered space, that the true power of the tale resides. For those who seek closure, the phantom town offers only frustration. But for those willing to accept ambiguity, it offers something deeper, a mirror of the human condition. We live with silences every day, gaps in memory, unspoken histories, losses without explanation. The phantom town is but one silence among many, magnified into legend because it resonates with what we all know, that much of life cannot be fully explained. And so, the story endures. Not because it has proof, but because it has silence. Not because it offers answers, but because it denies them. The coordinates remain, like scars on maps, like whispers in archives, like shadows in the trees. Travelers still pass through, still wonder, still listen. They will hear nothing. And it is that nothing that lingers longest. In the end, the legacy of the phantom town is not its absence, but its refusal to be forgotten. Silence, paradoxically, has preserved it more effectively than ruins ever could. The town exists in every retelling, every speculation, every moment of unease felt by those who hear the wind shift in the woods. Its voice is not a voice at all, but an emptiness that cannot be erased. And as long as silence itself has weight, as long as absence can be felt, the phantom town will live on, unseen, unproven, unresolved. There are stories that end with revelation, stories that end with justice, and stories that end with silence. Yet few end with an echo, something both present and absent, reverberating long after the final word has been spoken. The phantom town belongs to this rare category, for its legacy is not contained in maps, in ruins, or in archives, but in the lingering resonance of what can never be fully known. Even today, when technology has made the Earth's surface transparent, when satellites orbit above every continent, the coordinates remain unsettled. Maps are cross-checked, archives digitized, old surveys scrutinized. And still, the phantom town refuses to yield itself. It is as if every attempt to pin it down only drives it further into the margins of memory. The silence surrounding it does not dissolve with time. Instead, it deepens, expanding like a shadow across generations. In academic circles, the case is treated as anomaly. A cartographic error, perhaps. A settlement too small to endure. A community that lived briefly and disappeared without fanfare. These explanations bring comfort, because they render the mystery manageable. Yet even the most disciplined scholars admit, when pressed, that something about the disappearance unsettles them. Other errors leave traces, letters, contracts, a cemetery in the woods. Other abandoned towns leave shells of stone or wood. But here, there is only void. That void is the echo, repeating itself in every attempt at explanation. Folklore, on the other hand, thrives in the void. Where reason fails, imagination rushes to fill the space. Some say the town sank into the earth, swallowed by a hidden cavern. Others whisper of a curse, a punishment for secrets buried too deep. A few even suggest that the town never existed at all, that it was not erased but invented, a ghost conjured on parchment. These theories conflict, but each resonates, because each attempts to give shape to the echo. The echo does not exist in libraries alone. It reaches into the present, into the minds of those who stumble upon the story. Travelers passing through the region speak of a sensation they cannot explain. It is not fear exactly, nor awe, but something suspended between the two. A stillness in the air, as if the landscape itself remembers what the records have forgotten. In these moments, the echo becomes physical, almost tangible. Communities living nearest the phantom coordinates carry the story as inheritance. They do not always speak of it openly, but it is there, in the cautionary tales, in the sideways glances toward the forest. Children grow up hearing that some places are not meant to be entered, not because of monsters or dangers, but because they belong to silence. The lesson is subtle, almost moral: not all mysteries exist to be solved. Some exist to remind us of the limits of our knowledge. Writers, filmmakers, and seekers continue to chase the town, searching for an ending that will close the echo once and for all. They return from their journeys with photographs of empty woods, with soil samples, with stories of compass needles trembling. Yet when asked what they found, they cannot answer cleanly. They speak instead of atmosphere, of disorientation, of the unshakable impression that something once stood where nothing now stands. Their words do not end the mystery, they only extend the echo further. And so the town becomes less about itself and more about the human response to it. Why do we need the town to exist? Why does its absence trouble us so deeply? Perhaps because it touches upon a fear more intimate than ghosts or curses, the fear of being forgotten. The town reminds us that communities can vanish without memory, that names can dissolve without record, that entire lives can pass into oblivion without leaving a trace. It is not just a ghost town, it is the ghost of memory itself. In this way, the phantom town is no longer confined to its coordinates. It has become an idea, a parable disguised as a place. It tells us that permanence is an illusion, that silence is often more enduring than sound, that absence can weigh heavier than presence. It cautions us against arrogance, against believing that our stories will always be preserved. For if an entire town can vanish, what chance do we as individuals have? Yet there is also something liberating in this. The echo is not entirely bleak. In its refusal to be pinned down, the town defies finality. It resists being reduced to fact or fiction. It continues to exist, if not in the soil, then in the telling, in every voice that repeats its story, in every listener who wonders about it. In that sense, the town has achieved a kind of immortality. It is not remembered through ruins, but through uncertainty. Its silence has become its strongest voice. As the story closes, the echo lingers. It lingers in the quiet of the woods, in the gaps of maps, in the unease of those who look too long at the blank space where a community should have been. It lingers in us, because we carry it now. We have listened, and in listening, we have become part of the echo. The phantom town does not end. It reverberates. And perhaps, long after this telling fades, long after the names of those who whispered of it are forgotten, the echo will remain. Waiting, repeating, haunting.